Welcome back to the Welsh History Podcast, episode 134, Legacy. The winter of 1409 saw England celebrating its victory over Owain. Many shared toasts over bonfires, and triumphal parades rang through the streets of London. But even as his son, heirs, and wife languished in the Tower of London, Owain remained free from English jails or executioners. This consternating reality meant that the crown had to at least worry about him enough to keep his family alive, both as a threat and as a negotiation tactic. As you can understand, if they have your family and you try and cause trouble, they can threaten to kill them. That tactic would become less and less useful as time would go on, but nonetheless, it was something that Henry IV and later his son, Henry V, would continue to hold over the family of Owain Glyndŵr for quite some time to come. By 1415, there was now a new king on the throne, as Prince Henry was now King Henry V. He would offer olive branches to Owain over many different things, including offering pardons, suggesting that if he and his loyalists did homage to the king, he would actually receive a pardon, and of course the release of his wife and children. By this point, his son had already passed away due to illness, and later on things would continue to go downhill from there for his family. Some academics, like Professor Davies, see Owain as someone too stubborn to accept defeat. He felt that Owain would rather spend his days as a peasant on the run, always looking behind him so as to avoid capture, and therefore he would never live a truly peaceful life. And maybe that to a degree is true. The fact that we've mentioned in the past Owain's unwillingness to put up with surrender, with having his country defeated, having his castles taken, and yet still kicking on and still trying to at least gain a measure of revenge. And in his writings to the kings of France, he came across as someone who was looking for vengeance and wasn't really worried about, being seen as someone magnanimous or someone willing to come to terms. And in that respect, we've seen him be very much the leader that you would expect in the case of this situation where, he's not going to take surrender. He knows what happens to, outlaws and rebels in battle with Henry IV and in previous kings. They don't frequently end well. So just giving homage to a king might not mean a whole lot. Edward I, of course, famously killed a bunch of Scottish nobles for similar reasoning. And the reality is that I think with all of those examples and the general tendency in medieval politics to effectively be as devious as possible because you see yourself as a God-given king, allows a lot of latitude that wouldn't necessarily be the case for most people. And I think the other thing for Owain is that even if he does give in and does do homage, what's left for him? Even if he gets his family back, and maybe he would at that point. Let's for argument's sake, Henry V is much more magnanimous than Henry IV. And so instead of this vengeful, irritated king who wants to take his vengeance out on the person who caused him so much trouble and strife, he actually says, no, we're going to call this good. That's it. We're done. Do we think Owain gets back his territory, comes back to being a minor lord under the observance of Henry? I mean, that's very dubious. And I think the more likely path in a best case scenario is effectively he just becomes a peasant and maybe doesn't even have any land he can settle. He then has to rely on relatives to supply him with land, to give him an option to survive. Because at the end of the day, the English kings don't have to give him anything. And he's not their subject, realistically. So, yes, could it have ended better? Possibly. But the realistic side of this is, if you're Owain, you know where this is going to go. This is going to go with you being captured, arrested, tried, and probably summarily executed and drawn and quartered, and your head ends up on a pike somewhere. Because realistically, that's how medieval politics worked. It didn't work with nicety or kindness or dignity. It was all about showing your strength, showing how much you were in charge, and making people pay who crossed you, because you knew if you didn't, the likelihood is they'd cross you again. All you have to do is look at the Percys in that example and what they'd been doing. And certainly if you let Owain live, what's the likelihood he's going to mount yet another revolution down the road? I mean, if I'm King Henry V, I think it's pretty high. So with all of that in mind, even though Owain now is a very older gentleman, he can still be sort of the object for Welsh resistance. And even in his old age, would still be someone considered important enough in the Welsh community. So to capture him in some respect, even if it's just on a feint of, do us homage and we'll pardon you, I could see that being very much the English strategy and tactics of, we're going to offer this to you, but really we're not really offering this to you. Now, again, as I said, if the best case scenario is they did, even if he gets the pardon, he's not going back to the previous position. And realistically, he still is that threat. So why would you give him back the right and the ability to make income so that he could continue to finance being a threat? So with all of that in mind, from a strategic standpoint, it would be ridiculous for the English king to either A, let him live, or B, have any sort of authority within the English system. So in all likelihood, Owain is either dead or he's impoverished, and family or no, it didn't matter. And the realistic standpoint is, if you look at this, is that they starved his family to death. So the fact that he wouldn't give in and wouldn't accept their position, they were of no use to the king anymore, that family. So it was just as easy for him to just ignore them and basically mistreat them, because now they weren't something of a chip that he could use in some negotiation tactic. And, make no mistake, Henry V, for some, has been perceived as better than Henry IV. And maybe he was, but he was still a medieval king with medieval tactics and medieval thought processes. And the idea that you would be vengeful, that you would hold others to account for slights that were done to you, or, let's be honest, in this case, a major situation in which this person has opposed you fiscally, militarily, and has actually signed up an alliance with your greatest enemy, I don't think can realistically let him live. So even though there is this pardon on the table, I think it has to be taken in a measure of, this is a pardon in name only, and that Owain's life was always going to be ended if he actually parlayed with the king at some point and tried to do this. I just don't believe that Henry V would have accepted the homage as being the end of the story, and suddenly Glyndŵr gets his lands back and all of a sudden everything's copacetic. It never was going to be that way. And I think it's foolish to think it would, based on past kings and their tactics. And certainly Henry V doesn't come across as being that different from his father in that respect. So I think that's important to know. Now, of course, does Owain suddenly, by not accepting this, get into a better position? No, he doesn't. In fact, I think it's likely he eventually makes his way to the house of his daughter, Alice Scudamore, who had previously married Sir John Scudamore in secret. And John himself had actually fought against Owain in at least one siege that we know of. So it's a bit surprising to find out that this marriage had happened. In fact, it was so surprising to the general public because it was kept secret. And it actually didn't come out until 20 years after this that he had married her. And because of this finally being exposed by, and to, King Henry VI, he lost his position as sheriff of the local area and was dishonored by being related to Owain Glyndŵr. So you can see, again, that relationship is problematic. And the fact that Scudamore is in that position is interesting. So if Owain does go to Scudamore's house and his holdings and effectively lives out the remainder of his days there, be they 3, 4, 5, or even 10 years after that, his life is kept very secret. Only the people that live in the area would even know him or know who he is. Obviously, anybody who'd ever met him would know him on sight, but we know that there are very few images of Owain in life that we have. There's the seal that was given to France, which has his picture on it. There may have been things that were kept in the family, but honestly, there doesn't seem to be anything left of him. So he could have been just some stranger who moved there, some peasant that, maybe was involved with the war, but wasn't necessarily important to the war. And we do have this reputation of Owain as being able to hide himself as a peasant, which is how he escapes Harlech, they say. So all of these reasons gives probable cause to this. And some have claimed that he is buried there, that there is a grave for him on that land even today. But we've never had fully determined proof, which is part of what makes his non-public death so important to the Welsh psyche for many years to come, because now Owain goes from being this normal human being to being a myth and a legend, something of a person who just disappears. We don't have him there, and you see his, like Llewellyn the Last, for example, exactly what happened to him. He got his head lopped off in the end. His brother did too. Most of his family was put off into either the Tower of London or sent to monasteries and kept away from having kids and getting married, and the entire line was effectively extinguished in the process. That is documentable. It is obvious. It is something we can follow. Owain's...
Hi, I'm Nikesh Ragani, commentator and host of the India on 99.94 podcast. Several times each week, my co-host Sarah Waris and I will be bringing you the very best in Indian cricket chat, whether we're discussing the legend of Jhulan Goswami, KL Rahul's strike rate, the men's T20 death bowling woes, or the latest controversy involving the BCCI. We've got you covered. You can listen and subscribe via your usual podcast provider. Just search for India on 99.94. You can watch us via YouTube, and you can download the 99.94 app. If you love Indian cricket, then join our conversation.
A news story gets shared by a friend on social media, or you catch a tweet that really makes your blood boil. But how do you separate fact from fiction? That's the premise behind Disinformation, a 10-part series from Evergreen Podcasts and Emergent Risk International, coming this fall. Tune into Disinformation wherever you get your podcasts, and remember, don't believe everything you read. Hey, podcast listeners, I'm Paul Brandis introducing my podcast, Countdown to Dallas. It's a fascinating, in-depth look at the seemingly unconnected events that led to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. It's based on my book of the same title. In that book and in this podcast, I go all the way back to 1939, when Lee Harvey Oswald was born into a troubled and dysfunctional family. I'll follow his transient and often violent teenage years and young adulthood, painting a fuller picture of the man who would later become Kennedy's killer. I also take a look at events unfolding in that era, like Cuba and Vietnam, and I'll unpack the conspiracy theories too, not one of which has ever been conclusively proven. Subscribe to Countdown to Dallas at evergreenpodcasts.com or your favorite listening app, October 31st.
Disappearance acts as much in an Arthurian fashion of being a way to say that instead of being dead, he lives on. This concept of, he's hiding in a cave somewhere asleep until we need him again. These old mythologies, which come and probably are some of the oldest mythologies that we have in the island nation of Britain. These ideals of ancient heroes that could be called upon from death to come back and fight for the living, to overthrow a tyrant or to overthrow enemies. It's something that is steeply held in the belief system of most people. Like, all you have to do is think of, like, for example, in Christian ideals, Jesus Christ is imagined to come back, to return, his second coming, as they call it. And his second coming is perceived as being him coming back from the dead, bringing with him the instruments to take out the enemies of God, right? So in his case, it's the end of the world and there's judgment and blah, blah, blah. But that it's very common amongst all religions. This is not just, or all mythologies for that matter. This is not specifically strictly a Christian one. And it runs the gambit. This idea of an old hero or an old person of note who comes back to, return the world to where it's supposed to be, effectively. And so that's the image you get when Owain just disappears. You don't get this image of an old, beaten man who just dies of old age and hiding out in his daughter's household, basically hiding his true identity from anybody who they didn't trust. You get this image of this noble warrior king who disappears only to be called back at some future date, some mysterious, unannounced future date, might I add, which will give him a kind of a sheen that the likes of King Arthur had, that image of this noble warrior hero who was so noble that he, didn't die. He's kept by the Lady of the Lake in some mysterious circumstance, ready to return. So those kind of concepts float around Owain even to this day. Of course, now it's a cute myth that we talk about, but it is something that bards kind of projected this ideal of. And so you get this kind of thing still floating around in the Welsh mythologies going up to the modern era. Many scholars have suggested that Owain likely died not long after 1415. In fact, some even say 1415 is his death date. From my perspective, his age, the hard life he's had to lead in this period of his life, keep in mind he's in his 60s or his 70s at this point. He's been on the run. He's been a fugitive. He's had to hide out in places which probably aren't the greatest. Sleeping rough quite often would be common for these kind of for insurgents and rebels. So that kind of thing would be happening. And of course, yes, their experience and their ability to handle these things are different than ours, right? Like, if you put me out there living in the rough, I probably wouldn't fare very well. And I'm quite a number of years younger than Owain. But the reality of it is that, it was something more common, something done more often. And so we have to keep in mind that it wouldn't be quite the same. But this is also an era where if you get sick, you could die. And a cold could kill you, let alone anything else. So there's lots of things that you can put down there. So the fact that he's lived this long and had this kind of life, and effectively that stress and that hard living would have probably shortened most people's lives. So typically when you have these kind of situations happen, when you have a high stress, you have difficult experiences that cause you to have a rougher time, you're not eating as well, you're starving more often than you're not. All of these things can build up, and so once you do get settled back down, it can on occasions attack, and just the fact that you're not in this hyper sense of awareness, suddenly all this stuff kind of weighs down on you in one big ball and can cause you to have other problems all of a sudden kick up. We don't know. I mean, this is pure speculation on my part. There's no evidence of it one way or the other. We don't know. We just, the general sense is we last hear about him in 1412. We don't hear about him again. That's the last sort of Glyndŵr inspired anything that we hear about. And past that point, there is no evidence he lives beyond that. We just have references that we think show that he at least lived till 1415, because if you have Henry V still trying to offer a pardon, it probably means that they are suspicious that he is still alive, but that doesn't mean he is. And that could also be the other thing. So the other thing to keep in mind is playing on Owain along with all the physical stress is the mental stress of having your family imprisoned. Maybe he's heard about his son dying, maybe he hasn't. And certainly, as anyone will know, in those, if you get into a circumstance where they're worrying about family and all of that plays on you, and stresses are drivers to illness. And so, again, going back to my point, I guess, we would have to expect that's what happened with Owain, is that eventually just all of this either caught up to him or just his age caught up to him. And either one could be as likely as the other. So, with all of that in mind, what are we to make of the legacy of Owain Glyndŵr, the last native-born Prince of Wales? I think first and the most immediate historical notion is that Wales suffered and lost for what amounted to a false hope. The anger at the death of Richard II and the humiliation of the conquest by Edward I and the laws created that caused Wales so much stress and strain for Welsh people, that caused a lot of the Welsh nobility to lose power, to lose influence in the English system. These things drove the rebellion, but they won't go away. In fact, they'll worsen for the next 100 years, because at the end of the day, the Welsh will still be needing to pay, in quotes, for what they did in rebelling against the English. So the English will continue these harsh restrictions. So for the immediate period, Wales has taken a beating trying to revolt, trying to get its independence, and effectively what comes out of it is there's a lot less of them around, because a lot of young men and old men have died for this cause, probably some women as well. And in the midst of all of this, their lands have been pillaged, their livelihoods have been destroyed in some cases, their ability to feed their families has been impinged, and so there's a lot more poverty across the land. A lot more of the recovery that's going on is being hindered because, in part, in order to make them pay for the cost of this war, the English start to put even more pressure on the Welsh by putting more taxes in, saying that they need to pay effectively an indemnity for having fought the war against them. And so if you're a Welsh person, this war did not work in your favor. And so do you leave that circumstance with a positive attitude, or does it make you even less likely to revolt because of how bad it is? Or conversely, does it make you more likely to revolt again because of how bad it is? All of these things we can't say for any certainty. We don't really have a window on what the local peasant thought. We don't have a window really even on what most of the nobility in Wales thought of what went on. We only have a small, brief interlude of information, so we can't really say. And most of which is done with perspective of many years down the road. Like we know the writings of Adam of Usk, for example, who seemed to fall into both camps during the war and then came out very anti-Owain later on. Well, of course he's going to be anti-Owain because, of course, the war has ended badly. But during the war, if he'd have been writing his documents, would they had a different perspective? Would he have a different concept of what was going on? We don't know. And so it's harder to say kind of where the impression for the Welsh is. But you can imagine that losing that war and having such hope taken from you would have a detrimental effect on the population, and it would likely fall more in line just because of this. And in fact, what we do see is that the Welsh generally do, if not completely cave into what's gone on, certainly the amount of issues that the English have for the next 100 years are much smaller than they were in the previous 100. And that is, I think, the combination of everything, right? The poverty, the loss of life, the general inability to get the economy back underway again during that period, because you're crushed by so many different things. And I think, and the general lack of population, the lack of growable area already makes Wales a difficult place to live. Now add to that, half your family's dead and your crops have been taken and you've gone for at least 2 winters without food, that to last the full winter. So you're starving occasionally because you just cannot feed yourself with what's left. So all of those things would send people into a bit of a spiral. And you can imagine at that point, a lot of people just go, I just want peace. I want this to be over. I want to be able to live my life. So I don't even care anymore. And for a lot of peasants, maybe there was no real difference. It's hard to say what they thought beyond that fact. And a lot of times we are left to wonder, as I've speculated in the past, about whether or not they just didn't care who was collecting the taxes. Because at the end of the day, every monarch, every noble, every lord is still taking the same amount from you. So it's not like you gain anything just because there's a different leader and he speaks a different language. So all of that becomes less important to you than it would be, say, to someone else. So all of these things in mind, we have to keep that in our mind as we look at the legacy of Owain. But he still has a tremendous legacy to the population of Wales even today. We still put up statues to him in Wales. There's still name things after him. He's still a key proponent and example and identifying notion for people across all sorts of spectrums in Wales who look at leaders that have been important to the foundation stones of this country. And I think from that alone, his contribution has been massive. Has his contribution been a failure? No. But his rebellion was a failure. But his contribution to the Welsh psyche, the Welsh understanding of itself, and the Welsh process of dealing with English dominance, he is an important figure in it and remains so to this day, and will, in all likelihood, long after some of the notions of what we think of Wales and what we think of England have passed into non-existence. These characters live beyond that. Much like Julius Caesar and Boudica outlive their countries and even a faint remembrance of what their tribes and their ideals were at the time. Boudica, for example, long outlives any understanding of what she was and who she was, other than what we get from Tacitus. So these people matter and they have importance. Now, again, was Owain the driver of Welsh independence? No, he was not. Was he the person who became the figurehead of it? Yes, and eventually becomes the leader that everybody looks to. But we have to always remember that it's not so much the great man that's leading things that makes things happen as much as it is he's the right person in the right position at the right time that just happens to jump in front of the parade, to use a quote from a politician that I once heard say. So I think that is important to remember. And regardless, he is someone who I consider to be incredibly important. Obviously, I've spent a lot of time covering him over the last year, and I think his contributions to Welsh history are massive, and I think they're important. And even with so little to go on from his own perspective, we're still able to glean quite a lot of information, and it's been a joy covering him. And as we go beyond him and talk about the consequences of English matters on Welsh history, it's always good to think about, this last point of independence, this last flickering light in the darkness that will become the domination by the English if you were a Welsh nationalist, or the end of a separate Welsh nation in the face of a growing English monarchy that is going to become influenced by Welsh leadership not too far down the road, and we will be getting to that shortly. So thank you everyone for listening. Thank you for participating. Thank you for your comments, your questions, anything you raise. Please be sure to bring them forward to me. I am more than happy to discuss pretty much anything. And you can reach me at the Welsh History Podcast at gmail.com. You can also talk to me on Twitter at Welsh History Pod, or my own personal Twitter account, which is at LinsteadDM. If you want to follow me there, where I talk about things unrelated to Welsh history. And you can find everything we do at distractionsmedia.com, which is the overall kind of umbrella. And thank you guys for listening. Remember, you can always join us on facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast if you're on Facebook. And I look forward to speaking to you guys again in the next episode. Until then, everyone, take care. Have a great day. We'll talk to you later. Bye.
This has been a Distractions Media production. For more information, you can check out everything we do at distractionsmedia.com.
A news story gets shared by a friend on social media, or you catch a tweet that really makes your blood boil. But how do you separate fact from fiction? That's the premise behind Disinformation, a 10-part series from Evergreen Podcasts and Emergent Risk International, coming this fall. Tune into Disinformation wherever you get your podcasts, and remember, don't believe everything you read.